You never truly know the price of abandonment until someone hands you the bill. For 15 years, my mother treated me like a ghost. But the second my late stepfather left me a hidden fortune of $1.9 million, she suddenly reappeared, playing the grieving widow. She thought I was still that helpless 14-year-old girl. She had no idea the quiet man who raised me spent his final days building an inescapable trap. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. The servers in the data analysis room of Aerostream Dynamics hummed with a relentless, low-grade vibration that usually helped me focus. Today, it just felt like a drill pressing against my temples. The air tasted of stale ozone and dry erase markers. I stood in the narrow aisle between two massive mainframes, clutching a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold 3 hours ago. The harsh blue fluorescent light from a dozen weather tracking monitors painted the cramped room in the colors of a fresh bruise. When my cell phone vibrated against my hip, I almost ignored it. We had a massive squall line forming over the Midwest, and private aviation clients were breathing down our necks, but the caller ID showed a Vermont area code. I stepped away from the monitors and answered. "Am I speaking to Arthur's daughter?" a dry, gravelly voice asked. "This is David Hayes. I am the executor of your stepfather's estate." Arthur. It had been exactly 2 weeks since he took his last painful breath, his body finally surrendering to the brutal neurological disease that had slowly stripped away his motor functions. I swallowed hard, the cold coffee turning to ash in my mouth. "I am calling to formally inform you of the contents of his will," Mr. Hayes continued, his tone entirely devoid of the warmth Arthur had always possessed. "He has left the entirety of the Oakhaven estate in Vermont to you. The deed is already being transferred into your name." I leaned heavily against the cold metal casing of the server rack. The house, the sprawling, creaky old house with its wraparound porch and the massive oak trees. It was mine. But Mr. Hayes was not finished. "Furthermore, there is the matter of his liquid assets," the lawyer said, a shuffle of papers echoing over the line. "Liquid assets?" I echoed, genuinely confused. Arthur was a manual watchmaker. He charged pennies for repairs and spent his life hunched over a magnifying loupe in a dusty workshop. We survived on love and elbow grease, not cash. "Yes, it appears your stepfather held an active, highly lucrative patent for a micro-mechanical gear used in aerospace engineering. The royalties have been accumulating in a private trust for years." A brief pause. "He left you $1.9 million in cash." The room spun. The humming of the servers faded into a high-pitched ring. $1.9 million. The words felt like a foreign language. I did not cry. Instead, my mind violently pulled me back to his cluttered, oil-scented workshop. I saw the massive, unfinished oak grandfather clock standing in the corner, its brass pendulum still and lifeless. I remembered running my fingers over the raw wood as a teenager, asking him when it would finally tick. He would just smile, wipe his grease-stained hands on his apron and say, "When the time is right, when the time is right." Before I could even begin to process the sheer weight of what Mr. Hayes had just told me, the intercom on the wall crackled to life. "Are you there?" It was Brenda from Human Resources. She sounded deeply uncomfortable. "Could you come down to the main lobby immediately? You have a visitor." I hung up the phone with the lawyer, my hands trembling slightly. I navigated the maze of cubicles and took the elevator down to the ground floor. The lobby of Aerostream Dynamics was a sterile expanse of white marble and glass, and standing right in the center of it, looking like a venomous snake dropped into a sterile laboratory, was her. Eleanor, my biological mother. I had not seen her face in 15 years. The last time I saw her, she was packing a designer suitcase in the dead of night, leaving a 14-year-old girl behind for a real estate broker with a fatter wallet. She had not aged a day, preserved by expensive creams and pure, unfiltered selfishness. She wore a tailored crimson coat that practically screamed wealth, her hair blown out into a perfect, untouchable wave. She did not step forward to hug me. She did not offer a single word of condolence for the man she had once been married to. Her eyes, cold and calculating, swept over my wrinkled flannel shirt and tired face with absolute disgust. Without a word of greeting, she reached into her expensive leather handbag, pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope, and threw it onto the glass reception desk. The heavy thud echoed sharply in the quiet lobby. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, the shock of the lawyer's phone call suddenly colliding with the sheer trauma of her presence. Eleanor finally looked me dead in the eye, her lips curling into a cruel, knowing smirk. "It is an emergency injunction," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I am freezing the estate. You are not getting a single dime of my husband's money." I was 10 years old when the hurricane that was my mother made landfall in Arthur's meticulously ordered life. We arrived at the Oakhaven estate with nothing but a trunk full of designer knockoffs and Eleanor's towering, suffocating vanity. She had bankrupted her second husband and needed a quiet place to hide from the debt collectors. Arthur was just supposed to be her temporary stepping stone. He was a man made of quiet angles and perpetual patience, a widower whose hands were forever stained with the faint metallic sheen of machine oil and brass polish. His world was governed by the rhythmic, predictable heartbeat of escapements and mainsprings. He worshipped precision. He revered silence. Eleanor, on the other hand, treated silence like a personal insult. She filled the sprawling wooden house with the shrill sounds of daytime television, the clinking of cheap wine glasses, and endless complaining phone calls to her equally miserable friends. She wore heavy perfumes that choked the delicate scent of cedar and clock oil in the hallways. To her, Arthur was a pathetic small-town mechanic. She mocked his flannel shirts and his quiet demeanor, completely blind to the profound stability he offered a woman who was drowning in her own manufactured chaos. She was obsessed with the social spotlight, constantly hunting for a way back into the glittering high society she felt she had been unfairly exiled from. Arthur never tried to replace the father I never knew. He never once demanded that I call him Dad. He simply existed as a steady, unbreakable pillar in the crumbling architecture of my childhood. While Eleanor spent her afternoons locking herself in the master bedroom, nursing her grievances and her hangovers, Arthur noticed the things that actually mattered. When the nylon strap of my heavy school backpack tore, he did not just buy me a new one to brush me off. He sat at his workbench with a heavy-duty needle and thick waxed canvas thread, stitching it back together with the exact calculated precision he used on antique pocket watches. When my favorite stuffed bear was kicked under the heavy oak bed frame during one of Eleanor's frantic cleaning fits, he was the one who quietly got down on his hands and knees with a flashlight to rescue it. And every single Sunday, when he baked an apple pie, he would silently slice off the thick, caramelized edges of the crust and place them on my plate, because he knew it was the only part I truly loved. He built our relationship the same way he built his timepieces, gear by gear, action by action, proving his devotion without ever needing to shout it. But a woman like Eleanor could never endure stability for long. By the time I turned 14, the quiet life at Oakhaven had driven her completely mad. She had found a new mark, a flashy commercial real estate broker with a leased sports car and a heavy gold watch. I remember the night she decided to leave. A heavy autumn rain was lashing against the kitchen windows. I was sitting on the top step of the staircase, hidden in the shadows, listening to the bitter argument unfolding below. She was throwing clothes into a leather duffel bag, her voice sharp and loud enough to shatter glass. "I am leaving this pathetic graveyard of a house," she spat at Arthur, who stood perfectly still by the kitchen island. "And I am taking the girl." Arthur's voice was remarkably level, a quiet rumble beneath the thunder outside. "You do not even look at her, Eleanor. Leave her here. She has a life, a school. You do not want to be a mother." Eleanor laughed, a harsh, grating sound that still echoes in my nightmares. "Of course I do not want to be a mother. But courts mandate child support, Arthur. A teenage dependent is a guaranteed monthly check, and I am not leaving empty-handed. She is my ticket to a decent apartment until my new man secures his commission. She comes with me." She was talking about me like a piece of collateral, like livestock. The cold reality of her words paralyzed me on those stairs. But Arthur did not raise his voice. He walked slowly out of the kitchen, returning a few minutes later with a metal lockbox. He placed it on the counter. Inside was his entire life savings. Every meager dollar he had scraped together from repairing grandfather clocks and replacing watch batteries over a decade. "Take it," Arthur said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Take every single cent. In exchange, you will sign full legal guardianship of Tessa over to me tonight. You will walk out that door, and you will never use her as a bargaining chip again." Eleanor did not hesitate. The sight of the bundled cash completely erased any pretense of maternal instinct. She counted the money, signed the hastily drafted paperwork Arthur pushed across the counter, and walked out into the rain without even glancing up the stairs to say goodbye. When the front door slammed shut, Arthur found me trembling on the landing. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell me that she loved me deep down. He just sat beside me on the wooden steps, smelling of oil and rain, and placed his rough, scarred hand over mine. "Do not cry for her," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the ticking hallway clock. "Your time is far too precious to waste on someone who does not know how to value it." The years that followed my mother's departure flowed with the gentle, rhythmic cadence of a perfectly calibrated escapement. Growing up in the quiet sanctuary of Oakhaven, the heavy weight of abandonment slowly dissolved into the rich, cedar-scented air of Arthur's workshop. When I eventually packed my bags to move to the bustling city for my data analysis career, the physical distance did not sever our bond. We simply stretched the mainspring of our connection. We cultivated small, enduring rituals that anchored us across the miles. Every single birthday, a small, unassuming package would arrive at my apartment. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, would be a brand-new, hand-stitched leather watch strap. He sourced the finest calfskin, dyed it himself, and punched the holes with exacting precision. Each stitch was a silent testament to a father's enduring love, a physical reminder that even as time propelled me forward into adulthood, I remained securely fastened to my roots. But time is a relentless mechanism, entirely indifferent to the people who revere it most. The tragic irony of Arthur's fate arrived in his early 60s, masked as a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand. The diagnosis was a degenerative motor neuron disease. The doctor delivered the news in a sterile, brightly lit clinic, outlining the progressive loss of muscle control. For an ordinary man, it was a terrible tragedy. For a master horologist, a man whose entire universe was built upon the delicate manipulation of microscopic springs and hair-thin balance wheels, a trembling hand was an absolute death sentence. The very tools that had given his life purpose were suddenly betraying him. I refused to let him surrender to the creeping darkness of inadequacy. Every Friday evening, I would leave the concrete canyons of the city and make the 3-hour drive north to the sprawling, tree-lined estate of Oakhaven. I could see the frustration hardening in his eyes as his fingers fumbled with a pair of tweezers, his fine motor skills slowly eroding. So, I initiated a shift in our dynamic. I did not want to hover over him like a pitiful caregiver. Instead, I brought 2 cups of black coffee into the dusty workshop, pulled up a wooden stool beside his workbench, and demanded that he teach me. I asked him to explain the complex, labyrinthine schematics of escapement systems and gear trains. I turned the agonizing process of his physical decline into a rigorous apprenticeship. His trembling hands could no longer hold the tools, but his brilliant mind remained razor-sharp. He became the architect, and I became his willing student, tracing the intricate, intersecting lines of mechanical blueprints under the warm glow of the brass desk lamp. It was during those fading months that the peculiar habits began. Arthur had always been a meticulous record keeper, logging every replaced crystal and oiled mainspring into ordinary composition notebooks. But as his condition worsened, he developed an intense, almost obsessive fixation on a stack of antique leather-bound books he called his repair ledgers. He spent hours hunched over his desk, his shaky hand gripping a heavy brass fountain pen, writing furiously in an unusual thick, dark ink that smelled faintly of iron and camphor. Whenever I walked into the room to offer him a glass of water or remind him to take his medication, he would immediately slam the heavy covers shut. "These are not for your eyes, Tessa," he would instruct, his voice uncharacteristically stern. "Do not open them until the final chime rings." I chalked it up to the mental toll of the illness, the harmless paranoia of a man losing control of his physical vessel. His passing was as quiet and unassuming as the life he had led. He slipped away in his sleep on a Tuesday evening, a silent halting of the gears. No dramatic final words, no prolonged hospital vigil, just a peaceful cessation of movement. In the heavy, suffocating days that followed the funeral, I found myself wandering aimlessly through his abandoned workshop. The scent of machine oil and aged wood was still overwhelmingly potent, preserving his ghost in the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. In the far corner stood his magnum opus, the massive oak grandfather clock he had been building for as long as I could remember. I opened the glass door and looked at the intricate brass movement inside. The heavy pendulum hung perfectly still. Examining the beautifully chaotic arrangement of the internal mechanics, I immediately noticed the void. Exactly as he had left it, the entire system remained paralyzed, missing a single crucial gear near the center arbor. Yet the true crushing weight of his absence did not hit me while standing over the empty workbench or staring at the unfinished clock. The profound devastation arrived the very next morning. For the past 6 years, precisely at 6:30 in the morning, my phone would buzz with a text message. It was never a profound declaration of love. It was always a hyper-specific, meticulously researched weather forecast. 72 degrees today. Rain expected at 3:15 in the afternoon. Take the heavy yellow umbrella. The wind will break the blue one. I woke up in my city apartment, blindly reaching for my phone on the nightstand, waiting for the screen to illuminate with his quiet guidance. The clock struck 6:30, then 6:35, then 7. The screen remained dark. The silence in the room was deafening. There was no one left in the world to measure the skies for me. The emergency injunction was not merely a threat. It was the opening salvo of a brutal, suffocating war. Within 48 hours, the probate court officially docketed Eleanor's lawsuit. The air in my apartment turned instantly heavy, pressing down on my chest like the oppressive, static-laden atmosphere that precedes a Category 5 hurricane. I sat across the polished mahogany table in David Hayes's downtown law office, staring blankly at the thick stack of bound legal documents. The pristine white paper looked violently bright under the recessed lighting. The accusations printed in crisp black serif font felt like physical blows. The primary legal argument was a concept known as undue influence. Eleanor was not just contesting the distribution of the $1.9 million. She was painting a horrifying, fabricated masterpiece. Her official filing claimed that I had systematically isolated an ailing, vulnerable man from the outside world. It alleged that I had exploited his deteriorating mental and physical state, essentially holding him hostage in his own home to coerce him into signing a new will. The sheer audacity of the lie made my blood run freezing cold. She had spun my weekend drives and my desperate attempts to keep his mind sharp into a narrative of calculated elder abuse. Leading this vicious crusade was Eleanor's legal counsel, a man named Victor Vance. He was exactly the kind of predator my mother would hire. Vance was a high-priced litigator who wore bespoke pinstripe suits that cost more than my entire annual salary. He had the slick, practiced charm of a venomous snake, moving through the preliminary hearings with a terrifying, aggressive confidence. He did not just present arguments, he orchestrated theatrical performances meant to dismantle his opponents piece by piece. During our first mandated mediation session, the conference room felt completely starved of oxygen. Vance sat across from me, a smug, relaxed smile playing on his lips, while my mother sat beside him, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. Without raising his voice, Vance began sliding neatly categorized exhibits across the expansive wooden table. "Exhibit A," Vance purred, his voice dripping with condescension. He pushed a stack of high-lit credit card statements toward my lawyer. "A comprehensive record of pharmacy transactions spanning the last 18 months of the deceased's life, all processed on Miss Phillips' personal credit cards." I looked down. The yellow highlighted rows indicated purchases of a specific heavy-duty sedative. My heart hammered against my ribs. "My client," Vance continued smoothly, gesturing toward Eleanor, "is deeply disturbed by these findings. The records clearly show a massive influx of central nervous system depressants. We are prepared to argue that Miss Phillips actively kept the deceased in a chemically altered, compliant state to ensure her total control over his estate planning. Those were prescribed by his neurologist." I slammed my hands onto the table, the sudden sound echoing sharply in the quiet room. "He suffered from severe muscle spasms at night. I only picked them up from the pharmacy because he could no longer drive safely." Vance merely raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow, entirely unbothered by my outburst. "Perhaps, but a jury might look at the volume of these drugs and wonder why a loving daughter would administer such heavy doses right around the time the trust was finalized." He was twisting reality into a sickening, unrecognizable shape. But the credit card statements were only the opening act. The truly fatal blow, the strike that brought me entirely to my knees, was yet to come. Vance reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound notebook. It was not one of Arthur's thick, dark repair ledgers. It looked like a standard, cheap journal, the kind you could buy at any corner drugstore. He placed it in the absolute center of the table, treating it like a sacred artifact. "This," Vance announced, his voice dropping an octave to emphasize the gravity of the moment, "is the deceased's personal diary, recovered from the estate. It covers the final 12 months of his tragic decline. We submitted it into evidence this morning." My lawyer, David Hayes, frowned deeply and pulled the notebook closer, opening it carefully. I leaned over his shoulder, my eyes scanning the pages. The breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. The handwriting filling the lined pages was a jagged, erratic scrawl. The letters dragged and stuttered across the paper, clearly written by a hand severely compromised by a neurological tremor. And I recognized it immediately. It was undeniably Arthur's handwriting. The unique looping cross of his letter T and the sharp architectural angle of his letter A were unmistakably his. But the words written in that familiar, suffering hand were completely foreign. My eyes frantically locked onto a passage dated just 4 months before his death. "She yells when I drop things. I am so tired. Tessa keeps locking the workshop door. She says I am not safe, but I think she just wants me out of the way. I miss Eleanor. She was right to leave me. I want to give her the money. I need to make it right, but the girl will not let me call a lawyer." I recoiled from the table as if the notebook had physically burned me. My vision blurred, and a wave of pure, unadulterated nausea washed over me. It was a flawless, devastating lie. The content was sheer fiction, an evil inversion of the truth. But the ink and the agonizing tremors captured on the page were entirely real. Eleanor had found the absolute perfect weapon. She had exploited the most tragic symptom of his fatal illness, weaponizing his failing body against the only person who had stayed by his side. David Hayes closed the notebook, his face pale and tight. He asked for a brief recess and pulled me into a small, adjacent holding room. The door clicked shut, sealing us in a stifling, windowless cube. "Tessa, you need to listen to me very carefully," Hayes said, his tone entirely stripped of its usual professional detachment. He looked genuinely defeated. "We have a catastrophic problem. That diary is highly inflammatory. If this goes to a jury trial, 12 ordinary people are going to see a dying man's trembling handwriting begging for his ex-wife. They are going to see pharmacy receipts for sedatives. They will not understand the nuances of neurological care. They will see an abused, frightened old man." "It is a lie," I screamed, the suppressed grief and rage finally boiling over. "He loved me. He despised her. You know he bought me from her. We have the guardianship papers." "Guardianship papers from over a decade ago do not negate a diary written on his deathbed," Hayes countered, his voice firm but sympathetic. "Vance is going to obliterate our defense. I strongly advise you to consider a settlement. Offer her 50% of the liquid assets, $950,000. If you give her the cash, we can likely secure the Oakhaven house and keep you out of a grueling public trial that could cost you everything. 50%. Give her half of his life's work. Give the woman who abandoned us a massive fortune simply because she manufactured a compelling lie." I leaned against the cold drywall, the fluorescent lights humming mercilessly above me. In that suffocating silence, the true horror of Eleanor's grand design finally crystallized in my mind. She did not just want the $1.9 million. The money was only half the prize. The real victory, the ultimate vindication for her towering ego, was the total annihilation of our history. She wanted the legal system to officially declare that Arthur's love for me was a fraud. She wanted a judge's gavel to strike down the years of quiet devotion, the hand-stitched watch straps, the shared cups of coffee, and replace them with a permanent public record of abuse. She wanted to erase his existence as a loving father to prove that she had been absolutely right to walk away all those years ago. If I settled, if I gave her a single cent, I would be signing a confession to a crime I never committed. I would be letting her kill him a second time. "I absolutely refuse to settle," I told David Hayes, my voice steady and cold. "I will not give that woman a single dime. Prepare for a trial." I walked out of the mediation room and immediately drove north. The 3-hour journey back to Vermont was a blur of black asphalt and heavy falling snow. The night was pitch dark when I finally pulled into the gravel driveway of Oakhaven. The massive house stood silent against the freezing wind, but I did not go inside the main residence. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the glove compartment and walked straight toward the detached workshop in the backyard. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped into the freezing, oil-scented air. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping past rows of hand tools and dusty glass vitrines until it landed directly on the far corner of the room. The unfinished grandfather clock stood there like a silent sentinel. I approached it slowly, the floorboards groaning under my boots. I opened the tall glass casing and stared at the frozen brass mechanism inside. My eyes locked onto the empty void near the center arbor. I remembered the heavy silence of the room on the day he died. I remembered his calm, steady voice echoing in my memory. "When the time is right." My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. I set the flashlight down on the workbench and looked at my left wrist. Strapped to it was the custom timepiece Arthur had given me for my 27th birthday. I unbuckled the leather strap and laid the watch under the intense beam of his magnifying desk lamp. My hands were shaking, but I forced my breathing to slow down. I reached for a set of ultra-fine micro screwdrivers from his tool rack. With surgical precision, I popped the polished steel back casing off my wristwatch. I peered through the illuminated magnifying glass. Hidden deep beneath the oscillating balance wheel, entirely separate from the main timekeeping movement, was a singular, oddly shaped asymmetrical gear. It was tiny, no larger than a grain of rice, machined from a brilliant blue titanium alloy. I picked up a pair of needle-nosed tweezers and carefully extracted the blue gear. Holding my breath, I walked back over to the massive grandfather clock. I reached into the heavy brass machinery, aiming for the empty slot on the center arbor. The blue titanium gear slipped perfectly onto the exposed steel pin. It was an exact, flawless fit. For a terrifying second, absolutely nothing happened. Then, a deep metallic click echoed through the hollow wooden body of the clock. The heavy lead weight suddenly dropped a fraction of an inch. The massive brass pendulum swung to the left, caught the escapement, and began to tick. The sound was deafening in the quiet workshop. A second later, the grand chimes above the dial struck one long, resonant note. Before the sound could even fade, I heard the grinding of a heavy mechanical track. The solid oak paneling directly behind the grandfather clock unlatched and slid smoothly to the right, revealing a deep, hidden cavity built directly into the wall of the workshop. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it inside the secret compartment. There were no stacks of cash or velvet pouches of gold jewelry. Instead, neatly arranged on 2 wooden shelves, were dozens of heavy leather-bound books. They were the secret repair ledgers he had furiously guarded during his final months. I pulled the first heavy volume from the shelf, carried it to the workbench, and flipped it open. The pages were covered in his meticulous, structured handwriting, penned in that distinct camphor-scented dark ink. As I read the first few pages, the breath caught in my throat. I stood there, utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what I was reading. Arthur was not just a master horologist. He was a paranoid genius. He had known exactly what would happen. He knew that the instant his aerospace patent became public knowledge upon his death, the scent of the massive fortune would draw Eleanor back from the shadows. He knew she would come hunting for the money, and he knew she would try to destroy me to get it. So he spent his dying days engineering a trap she could not possibly escape. I frantically turned the pages. The ledger was a comprehensive forensic diary of his own decline, backed by hard, irrefutable evidence. He documented his early medical treatments with clinical detachment. He recorded the exact pharmaceutical lot numbers and the prescribed dosages of an aggressive, early-stage medication his doctors had tried. Underneath the drug codes, he meticulously documented the severe psychological side effects the pills caused him. He experienced vivid hallucinations, night terrors, and intense bouts of irrational paranoia. My eyes widened as I read the entry dated exactly 8 months prior. Arthur had realized his mind was playing tricks on him. He knew he was writing terrifying, nonsensical things on scrap pieces of paper during his chemically induced panic attacks. But instead of burning those cheap drugstore notebooks, he stopped throwing them away in the house. The next page contained a glossy printed photograph attached to the paper with architectural tape. It was a still frame captured from a motion-activated trail camera Arthur had secretly mounted high in the oak tree overlooking the driveway. The grainy night vision photo clearly showed a man in a dark jacket rummaging through Arthur's exterior garbage bins. Arthur had noticed the tampered trash. He had trapped the license plate of the intruder's vehicle and hired a discreet investigator of his own to run the plates. He discovered the man in the driveway was a private detective directly employed by Eleanor and Victor Vance. Once Arthur knew Eleanor was digging through his garbage looking for dirt to invalidate his will, he sprang his trap. He actively fed her the poison she desperately wanted. He deliberately tore the pages of his drug-induced, paranoid ramblings out of the cheap notebooks and tossed them directly into the trash bins for her private detective to find. He knew she would save them. He knew she would use them to build her case. But the final, devastating piece of the puzzle was taped to the very last page of the ledger. It was a physical, carbon-copied receipt. Arthur's own investigator had managed to bribe a paralegal at Victor Vance's firm to secure a copy of the billing invoice. The document clearly detailed a massive cash payment from Eleanor to the private detective, specifically itemized for the retrieval of discarded paper documents from the Oakhaven estate, dated 8 months ago. I stared at the invoice, tears of absolute shock and profound awe streaming down my face. The diary Eleanor had presented to the court was not a weapon she had cleverly forged. It was a loaded bomb Arthur had personally built, handed to her, and patiently waited for her to detonate. The time machine was never meant to take us back to the past. It was designed perfectly to destroy her in the future. The grand mahogany doors of the county probate courthouse sealed us inside a room that felt more like a gladiator arena than a hall of justice. The air conditioning hummed a low, sterile note, masking the underlying tension that gripped the benches. The final hearing had arrived. Eleanor was currently seated on the witness stand, delivering the performance of a lifetime. She wore a modest, high-necked black dress, a stark contrast to her usual vibrant, expensive wardrobe. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her perfectly manicured hands, her shoulders shaking with manufactured grief. "I only wanted to say goodbye to him," Eleanor sobbed, her voice cracking with expertly calculated vulnerability. "I knew his mind was fading. I knew my daughter was keeping him locked away in that dreadful workshop, feeding him those horrible pills. When I read his diary, his trembling words begging for me, my heart simply broke. He died terrified and completely alone." From the plaintiff's table, Victor Vance stood tall, his custom-tailored suit catching the dim courtroom light. He let her fake tears linger in the heavy silence before turning to address the judge. "Your Honor," Vance began, his voice echoing with righteous indignation, "the evidence is insurmountable. We have the deceased's own tragic handwriting, written in the final agonizing months of his life. We have credit card statements proving a massive influx of sedatives purchased by the defendant. This is a textbook case of undue influence and elder abuse. I ask this court to immediately invalidate the fraudulent will and return this $1.9 million estate to the woman Arthur truly loved." He sat down, flashing a brief, predatory smirk in my direction. David Hayes stood up. He did not rush. He calmly buttoned his suit jacket, picked up a heavy, evidence-tagged cardboard box, and walked to the center of the floor. "Your Honor," Hayes said, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "The defense moves to enter a new suite of evidence, recovered just 3 days ago from a hidden architectural vault built by the deceased. Furthermore, we call our final witness to the stand, Dr. Elias Thorne, a board-certified forensic document examiner." The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, frowned but nodded. Vance instantly objected, but the judge overruled him, her curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in our strategy. Dr. Thorne, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, took the stand. Hayes handed him the thick, leather-bound repair ledger I had found inside the clock. "Dr. Thorne," Hayes asked, "can you verify the authenticity of the journal currently in your hands and compare it to the cheap notebook submitted by the plaintiff?" "I can," the expert replied confidently. The plaintiff's notebook was indeed written by Arthur, but chemical analysis of the standard ballpoint ink proves those pages were written over a year ago, during a documented period of medication-induced psychosis. However, this leather-bound ledger is entirely different. It is written in a rare, custom-mixed iron gall ink containing trace amounts of camphor. The oxidation levels of this specific ink prove conclusively that this ledger was written months after the plaintiff's notebook. This ledger represents the final, lucid thoughts of the deceased. Vance jumped to his feet. "Objection! This is highly speculative." "Overruled," the judge snapped, leaning forward. "Proceed, counselor." "Thank you, Your Honor," Hayes said. He turned back to the witness. "Dr. Thorne, did you find anything unusual about the text inside this authenticated ledger?" "I did," the doctor stated, a hint of awe in his professional tone. The deceased was a master horologist. He documented his mechanical repairs in extreme detail. However, on page 42 there is an anomaly. If you isolate the first letter of every single line detailing the gear ratios and spring tensions, it forms a perfect acrostic cipher, a hidden message. A heavy, breathless silence fell over the courtroom. Eleanor dropped her crumpled tissue. Vance froze mid-step. "And what exactly does that hidden message say, Doctor?" Hayes asked. Dr. Thorne adjusted his glasses and read from his official report. The letters spell out the following sentence: "Eleanor will use my discarded scrap paper to extort my daughter. This is the evidence." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. The judge slammed her wooden gavel down violently, demanding order. Eleanor's face drained of all color, turning a sickening ashen gray. She looked like a ghost trapped in the harsh fluorescent light. "Your Honor, there is one final piece of evidence," Hayes announced over the dying whispers. He retrieved a tiny silver digital storage drive from the evidence box. Dr. Thorne discovered this drive surgically embedded inside the leather binding of the ledger. "We request permission to play the video file it contains." The judge granted the request. A large television monitor was wheeled in front of the witness stand. The screen flickered to life. There was Arthur. He was sitting at his workbench, the massive grandfather clock visible over his shoulder. He looked incredibly tired, his left hand trembling violently against the wood, but his eyes were sharp, bright, and completely lucid. "To the presiding judge," Arthur's voice echoed through the courtroom, deep and steady. "If you are watching this, it means I am dead, and my ex-wife Eleanor has attempted to steal my estate. A few months ago, I was prescribed a medication that caused severe hallucinations. I wrote terrifying things on scrap paper. When I realized my mind was compromised, I stopped the medication. But I also discovered Eleanor had hired a private investigator to dig through my trash. She was looking for ammunition." Arthur smiled softly, a brilliant, calculating spark in his eyes. "So, I gave her exactly what she wanted. I intentionally threw my paranoid ramblings into the garbage bins for her to steal. I knew she would save them to use against Tessa. Attached to the final page of this ledger, you will find the illicit billing receipt from Eleanor's private detective, proving she orchestrated this theft 8 months ago. Tessa is my daughter in every way that matters. Eleanor is a thief. I leave my legacy to the one who stayed." The video ended, leaving a deafening, crushing silence in its wake. The trap had snapped entirely shut. The time machine had worked flawlessly. Eleanor was no longer crying. She sat frozen, her jaw unhinged, staring at the blank television screen in sheer, unadulterated terror. Vance physically backed away from her, realizing his own career was now in catastrophic jeopardy for presenting fabricated, stolen evidence to a judge. The judge did not waste a single second. She looked down at Eleanor with a gaze of pure, freezing contempt. "This lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice," the judge declared, her voice slicing through the room like a steel blade. "Furthermore, I am instructing the district attorney's office to immediately open a criminal investigation into the plaintiff, Eleanor, for felony fraud, extortion, and the falsification of legal evidence. We are adjourned." The sharp crack of her gavel was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I stood up and walked down the center aisle. I did not run. I did not gloat. I simply walked out. Behind me, Eleanor suddenly shattered, letting out a shrill, hysterical scream as she began viciously arguing with Vance, blaming him for the failure as the court bailiffs moved in to surround them. The sweetest, most absolute revenge was not screaming back at her. It was the cold, clinical exposure of her rotting core to the entire world. 3 weeks later, I sat on the wrap-around porch of the Oak Haven estate, sipping a cup of hot black coffee. The winter snow was beginning to melt, revealing the resilient green grass underneath. The estate was legally mine. The $1.9 million was secure in my accounts. But I did not quit my job, and I did not buy a sports car. Instead, I used a portion of the funds to officially register a charitable organization. I called it the Little Gear Foundation. Its sole purpose was to provide full mechanical engineering scholarships to orphaned and abandoned youth, giving kids who had been thrown away a chance to build something beautiful and precise. Through the open window of the workshop behind me, I could hear the deep, resonant ticking of the grandfather clock. The blue titanium gear was spinning flawlessly, driving the massive brass hands forward, second by second, minute by minute. Arthur had been right all along. Time is a relentless mechanism. It cannot truly heal every wound, and it cannot erase the scars of abandonment. But time is not supposed to be a cure. It is a canvas, and the people who actively choose to stay, the people who sit beside you in the rain and stitch your torn pieces back together, are the ones who make our time truly meaningful. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.